Hello, welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here in Coleraine, Northern Ireland at Ulster University, where we're going to be speaking about language in Northern Ireland, which, as you can imagine, depending on how you look at it, can be quite a contentious issue. But what we're going to try to do today is have a civil discussion about different perspectives of language in Northern Ireland. And I have with me three faculty members from Ulster University. Francis Kane is to my immediate left, Niall Comer, who's to the left further, and then Frank Ferguson, who's further to the left, not politically, but in terms of the table. So let's get started. If we can talk about some of these issues about language in Northern Ireland. Francis, how do you see, you're a linguist, how do you see language in Northern Ireland?
Well, for me, language in Northern Ireland and the linguistic landscape of Northern Ireland is a real potential to tapping into the story of the land and the story of the country. So in a way, languages can be contentious and people can disagree on what languages are called and what their status is, but as a researcher who looks at place names as markers of the linguistic landscape, I think that the names can tell us much about the languages that were spoken here historically and today.
And in terms of that historical perspective, so some people no doubt would say, well, that was ancient history, why are we still talking about that today? And other people would say, well, that's the key thing.
Well, I suppose there's two perspectives. If I come at this with my linguist hat on, as a researcher who looks at how language works, and languages work together when they come into contact with each other, the place names are a real fruitful source to see what kind of products we get from whenever 2 or 3 languages are spoken in the same place, and then how that's recorded in the landscape of the place. But second to that, they're very much historical markers or fossils of the past, but these are also names that we use every single day when we look at Google Maps or if we watch the news and hear that something is happening in a particular place. We're still using these names every single day, so they're very much alive in Ireland today, yeah.
Fair enough. And Neil, do you agree with that? Do you see that the names are still alive today?
Absolutely. I feel that, as Francis has said, the key to understanding our linguistic past and moving to a more accepting linguistic future is a realisation that the names and their component parts and the different cultures that are reflected in the names are integral to a sort of shared understanding of, as Francis mentioned, not only our linguistic past but a linguistic future that we can strive towards. So I feel that they are very much a key. Place names are very much a key for people who didn't perhaps have the opportunity due to their social or political or religious background to embrace either of the cultures. And I say either of the cultures with a warning that there's a lot more than just, it's not just simply one culture versus another. There are so many component parts. So I feel that it's a good, I suppose, the place names are a very, to use a often used term, a very safe sort of landing ground or a very neutral zone in which people can embrace the cultures that have made up Northern Ireland.
Well, speaking of the neutral zones, I believe in addition to teaching, you also are involved in a national organization to protect the Irish or the Gaelic language. Mm-hmm. Am I using the correct term?
Absolutely. Both terms are used. Gaelic, which is a reflection of the word Gaeilge, which is the language in the language. And it's a lot of people just simply refer to it as the Irish language. Indeed, it was referred back to Queen Victoria talked about the Irish language. Queen Elizabeth talked about the Irish language. So it's not something that's just people in Ireland have invented over the past number of years. The organisation I'm involved in, I'm the outgoing president of Conradh Gaeilge, which is translated as the Gaelic League. It was set up in 1893 to enhance, promote, protect the Irish language, which was in a pretty difficult state. This was sort of post-famine, when you had a population drop of nearly 50% of people between death and emigration. And a lot of these people, the majority, would have been native Irish speakers. So we find ourselves with a huge drop in speakers, and then the association of the language in the late, 19th century, the association of the language with poverty, and the removal, the insistence, for example, that all education in Ireland was through the medium of English. So the language finds itself at the end of the 19th century in a perilous state, and Conradh Gaeilge is established by Douglas Hyde, who would go on to become the first president of Ireland. And it's set up to really indeed enhance through its branch network throughout Ireland. Branches would be established in a certain area, and people were taught how to reconnect with the language, and it was encouraged as a community language. And this has grown over the years through various campaigns that Conradh Gaeilge have been involved with. Our most recent campaign, I suppose, amongst others, is the attempts to implement legislation within Northern Ireland to protect the language and to take it away, I suppose, from any whimsical decision making by politicians who may be using the language or maybe working against the language for their own goal. So really, that is our idea. We're a non-political organisation, and our purpose is to help people re-engage with the language and to protect the language in the public sphere.
If I had a 10-year-old student and I lived in Belfast, what language would my student be learning in school?
Okay, so you have two options. There's a very thriving Irish medium movement at the minute. So you have the option that you can send your kids to an Irish medium primary school where they receive all their instruction through the medium of Irish. And you also have that option now at secondary level. Although the provisions, there's still quite a way to go for that provision to be available everywhere throughout the north. And indeed, in the Republic of Ireland, you have the same option. If you choose English medium education, unfortunately, there are no provisions for modern languages at all, never mind just Irish, at primary school level. And so you really wouldn't engage in the language until you're, I suppose, 11 or 12, would it be? And it's just taught almost as a school subject. The option that you do have if you're studying Irish is that you learn the language from scratch. Then you have the opportunity in the summer to attend the Gaeltacht courses. Now, the Gaeltachts are regions in Ireland in which Irish is still spoken as the native, the first language of the community. So it's almost like a summer college. You go up for three weeks, 4 weeks, and you live with a family. It's great. Myself and Francis both have that experience, and it's a life-changing experience for kids. The other option is you can work within your branch net. If you have a local branch net, you can attend night classes and you can reach different levels of fluency. You see, for example, this symbol, the fáinne, and this is a gold fáinne which shows proficiency in Irish. So, for example, if you have, we have a booklet which is almost like a syllabus, but it's a very relaxed syllabus outside the mainstream education, which concentrates on spoken Irish and Irish within the family and in the community. So the options are there for students, but we still have a lot of way to go. It's very much under-resourced and a lot of times misunderstood.
Fair enough. And Frank, if we can bring you into this, my understanding is you're an expert in the Ulster Scots language.
Yes, and I suppose in some ways we could be seen as the poor cousin of minority languages in the north. The Scots language, as you might imagine, is something that developed in Scotland and then came over here through times of settlement and migration. And if we want to think about language in the north of Ireland, it's very much a spectrum of language that in many ways English, I don't like to use the word predominates, but you would have a majority of speakers who are English speaking, that there's a very healthy Irish language sector. With Ulster Scots, it's really, I suppose, 100 years behind the development of Irish. It's often quite misunderstood. It's almost seen by some as something that was invented after the Good Friday Agreement to create a kind of parity of esteem in languages so that the unionist community would have their own minority language and funding would then be placed within that. Looking at the archives of written material in Scots in Ireland, that this goes back to the 17th century at least. And it has had quite a thriving literary tradition, and this was something that I would have great interest in. So I've always scratched my head a little at this sort of things started in the 1990s in Ulster Scots. But it shows part of the difficulties with language issues, not just for Ulster Scots, but in the acceptance of language and actually the sharing of language. So many unionist areas have Irish names, and it's one of the challenges for us here is to embrace that. Somewhere one of the most Protestant areas in Belfast is the Shankill. And I'll not muck up the translation of that, but maybe let Niall explain what that is.
Francis for that one. It's ancient old church, Shankill.
Yeah. So today, when you think about Shankill, I suppose for the American audience, if you come to Belfast and you do a black taxi tour, they'll probably take you up the Shankill Road and down the Falls Road, but it's a predominantly unionist area. But the name obviously goes back a lot longer than the black taxi tour. So Shankill is from the Irish Shankill, the word for an old church, or the name of an old church, and it actually refers to the parish of Shankill, which actually covers most of the modern city of Belfast. So, when I'm referring back to the place names, the history is there behind the name, but it's just whether or not a particular community or group decides to embrace that. And in terms of place names and signage, there's a very interesting mural on the Shankill Road. And it says Shankill, the hidden history of the Shankill, and then it says, which means ... the old church. So there is an acceptance in the area that this is we know that the origin of this is old church, but they omit with the dots that it's the Irish for old church. So it's very interesting to see the way, I suppose, these types of issues are portrayed in the linguistic landscape and within these communities. But there's certainly a really interesting mix going back historically and in the names that we use today.
That is interesting because since I've been in Northern Ireland, somebody told me a joke, and I might be butchering the joke, so excuse me if I'm butchering this joke in an offensive way, but somebody said that some people call Londonderry, and some people call it Derry, and that some people put a slash between them, so they just call it slash, so that way they don't have to say the word Londonderry or Derry.
Yeah. Do you want to take that one?
Jerry Anderson calls it Stroke City, and he meant the stroke, Derry stroke Londonderry. I mean, it's to me, it's not. I'm not saying that it's much ado about nothing, because it has caused a lot of I suppose controversy over the years. But the explanation is quite simple. The city was called after the London companies, which during the plantation of Ulster had acquired a lot of land, I suppose, from Coleraine moving over towards Derry City. And for example, you had other companies like the Drapers, who established Draperstown.
I think just to add to that, the process of names being borrowed and shifted is one that we see across the world. You just need to think about the United States. You've got New York, you've got New England. We actually there are two towns. I can't remember what state they're in. And there's a Derry and there's a Londonderry in the United States, and they're about 30 miles from each other. So it's just interesting that names are borrowed, and as well, which is kind of prevalent to where we're sitting today. So that Derry was the name of the settlement from Dira, but we know now today that we have the city of Londonderry and the county of Londonderry, but the county which is now Londonderry was actually anciently the county of Coleraine, which was changed whenever the London addition was added to Derry. So even the name of the county has changed from Coleraine, which was the prominent town at the time whenever it was the county, and it lost. Coleraine was lost to the history books in terms of the county. So names change and morph and reflect, changing social situations. And I think it's something that should be celebrated and explored rather than a cause for people to fight about.
So what does Coleraine mean?
So Coleraine comes again from Irish or from Gaelic, and it comes from Cúil Rahan, so the corner or the nook of the ferns, reflecting obviously the landscape and the plants that were prominent here at the time. So that's the meaning of Coleraine, yeah.
Interesting. And in terms of literature, if we can get to the issue, since we are at a university, what are students studying in terms of the literature, not just the language, but I suppose that if the language is so important and the place names project that you're working on is so crucial, I assume people are reading different books as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of emphasis, and this emphasis has changed over the years, and it obviously depends what course you follow. Our undergraduate degree course, which happens on the campus in Magee in Derry, And our students study Irish language and literature. And I suppose in terms of what they read, there's very much a canon of Irish language literature, which classic writers, Gaeltacht writers, modern poets, etc. And a lot of the work is actually, I suppose, a lot of the literature that they read is your normal, I suppose, what would be expected in any sort of literature genres. You've got literature that's very rural, but then you have attempts at sort of modern stories, and you have attempts at deeper philosophical works. So there's an attempt, obviously nowhere near the extent to which Frank would be dealing with, but we do have a lot of modern writers coming through. And incidentally, probably one of the most famous poets that have modern Irish language poets is Cathal O'Sharkey from the Donegal Gaeltacht, and he uses and draws a lot on place names actually within his poetry, because one of the themes that we study a lot in Irish literature, and this is from A-level, which is the exam the students do before they come into university, right through, is the phrase táhacht na haite duhish, which means the importance of your native place. And you find that this is reflected on a lot in the literature that we study. So, but I do think, I mean, in terms of volume of literature, I think that there's a huge volume of stuff.
I think this is one of the really exciting times looking at, because Irish literature means so many things. Here it's the literature in Irish, but it's also the literature in English and increasingly also in Ulster Scots, which we do in the Coleraine campus. And we would try and reflect, I think, a lot of the new voices that are coming through. For a while Irish literature in the north, was very much placed upon people like Seamus Heaney and Kieran Carson, who are outstanding global figures. There has been a whole new range of writers, particularly women writers and genre fiction, and just recently we've run a very successful project looking at migrants to the north and to Ireland and to their type of writing as they see their version of places here, and it's a really exciting time, I would think, because people are tapping into setting a new tradition, but also drawing upon the traditions that both Francis and Niall work with, and this is a big growth time, I think, in our writing, based upon the uniqueness of our language. And language in the widest sense, that it's a mixture. In the same way, if you look at American writing, that you have that melting pot of tradition and voices. In the North, I think we have one of the very unique places in the world that practically allows you to say one thing three ways. And for any creative writer, that's a fantastic opportunity to say the most precise thing in the best way they possibly can.
Yeah. That's interesting. And the migrants who you were referring to, where are they from?
They're from everywhere, as the world position of people coming from Africa, from Asia, from Europe, and post troubles and post conflict, Ireland as a whole and Northern Ireland as part of that has seen new peoples coming in, and it's really can be a really exciting time. I know for some people this causes a lot of worry and unfounded anxiety, but I think for anybody to see new cultures, new ideas, new people wanting to come here, it offers new perspectives on who we are and what Irishness is, and indeed when you hear Ulster, when you hear, say, a Polish person speaking with an Ulster Scots accent, it's a wonderful affirming thing of how language is a tool for communication, and that this place can be a home for anybody in a way, and indeed the languages that we use here provide means to create homes for those people.
That's interesting. And in terms of creating the homes for people, how in post-Troubles era do you do your best to make sure that Northern Ireland is as open as possible?
Well, I think ironically it comes from how we deal with Indigenous culture, because how can we get a sense of inclusion and safety for anybody new if we can't actually address how our Indigenous cultures get on and share the space? There's a lot of discussion north and south about a shared future, but we often at times have to recognise the shared past, that yes, there was a conflict, but not everybody was in conflict, and not everybody was wanting to continue that conflict. And I think we have to look back, particularly the study of Irish language within the Protestant community in the 19th century is a really powerful story of the language crossing the community, because it was just it was accepted, it was used, and it was researched and indeed preserved by some really key figures. The same with Ulster Scots within the nationalist and Republican community. You might have noticed in your time here how prevalent the word "we" is, and this is a word that is used across, a word from Scots, but a word that's used across the community as well, and it suggests that there are a number of words that were quite happily borrowed and indeed taken to the ultimate usage by people in the north of Ireland.
And Frances, given your work in the place names world, do you agree with that?
Absolutely, and I think what Frank touched on there is the unconscious multilingualism that we all have. People are, whenever we were getting ready for this panel today, one of the people that were helping out asked us to scooch over. Scooch is, I don't know if there's an equivalent to it in standard English, but it's moving across, but a little bit maybe. So I don't know what the origin of it is. It could be Hiberno, Irish English, it could be Scots. So we very much are using these different languages without even thinking about it, because as Frank said, it's a tool for communication. You don't really think about what language you're using when you're trying to ask someone to do something or communicate a thought. And very much place names do the exact same thing. So as well as having place names that are Irish origin or English origin, we also have ones that are Old Norse origin from when the Vikings were here. But we also see strange calques and strange mixes in that names pick up different elements from different languages that are then kind of combined in a linguistic sandwich, I suppose, for the name. But the interesting thing about those types of examples is that very often the languages that appear in the names are referring to the same thing. So it shows a sort of commonality in that the people that have named these places, they see them in the same way, but they just say them in a different way. So my favourite example that I turn out every time I'm talking about languages and place names is a river called Burn Tullet River, not far from where we are today actually. But the three components of Burn Tullet River come from three of the languages that were spoken here, contemporary and historically. So Scots, Irish and English, but the three components of that name in the three languages refer to the same thing. So Burn being the Scots word for a river, English being the English word for a river, and then Tullet coming from the Old Irish tullage, which meant like a flooding or an abundance. So Burn Tullet River is actually river, river, river in three languages. But I suppose it's showing us that the people that have inhabited this place over time, they still looked at this thing and knew that it was a river, but their tongue gave it a different form.
Yeah. That's interesting.
We can find ourselves in a multilingual society where the languages and the cultures, that we're not even having a discussion about, should we say Londonderry or should we say Derry, that is made irrelevant. That the only discussion should be about why is it called Londonderry, why is it called Derry Chalamkillia, that it's not somebody deliberately not saying one version to either offend another person or be offended themselves. So I think that we need to find ourselves in a situation where the languages are accepted as an integral part of what we are. And I mean, this doesn't refer just to the geographical boundaries of Northern Ireland. Languages cross borders all the time. You go into Donegal, you go into the border areas of Cavan, Monaghan, you see, and the language changed further we moved down Ireland. And even if you look at the approach to the Western Isles of Scotland, this was one, I suppose, island nation, and I mean not with a small political P, but it was one linguistic area, and it has been made up by originally predominantly Gaelic languages, but then, as Francis mentioned, the influence of Norse, the influences of Norman French, the influences of English, the influences of Scots, and we have to get to a point where this is something that we celebrate, and that we actually can discuss and enjoy, and there isn't a paranoia about something that shouldn't be. It should be something that we can embrace, because it reflects who we all are.
Well, fair enough. Well, I thank you for embracing that, and thank you for sharing that today. I think we're going to have to leave it at that, and I think we did do a fair job of embracing that through this conversation. So thank you all very much for coming on the show today. Okay. And if you would like additional information about the show, please go ahead and send me an email to highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. If you would like additional information about Ulster University, please go to ulster.ac.uk. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.